What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. About a week and a half ago I tried out playing full AD Renekton on stream and it was actually a lot of fun, and with Renekton being played in Worlds this year, it's actually proven to be a pretty strong pick as it benefited quite a lot from the new items that were introduced a while ago. So the main thing that full AD Renekton has is that he has a lot of damage and some very unexpected bursts that takes a lot of players by surprise, especially if you lane against a squishy champion. You can max your W, and with the full AD scaling on that ability, you can use the empowered W effect to trade amazingly versus a squishy champion, and sometimes you could flash in on them and do some crazy burst combos. And that unexpected power goes a really long way in solo queue, and yes, it does mean that full AD Renekton is a little bit of a cheese pick, but it's actually pretty good. And honestly, in solo queue, cheese is good. It's not something that you necessarily want to avoid because you get so much power from playing something that your opponents don't know how to play against. And with a W max, you're going to do amazing in lane versus squishy champions, and with a Q max, you could do amazing in lane versus melee champions because of the heal and extended range on the ability with the empowered effect. And because of that, his laning is actually quite strong, and if you ever manage to get a lead, his dive potential is like absolutely fantastic. Honestly, it's insane because his ultimate makes his tower diving just so fantastic when comboed with his burst damage when you're building full AD on him. Since it is a full AD champion, it makes Renekton have a playstyle somewhat similar to Riven in a sense, and so it becomes fairly snowball reliant, and that's something that you do have to watch out for. So trading in lane is very important, and if you fall behind a little bit, full AD Renekton is not going to be that good, and you're going to have to switch to a tankier build. But you can start out the game with this full AD option, and you can transition into it when you start to pick up a small lead in lane. And because of his gap closers and crowd control, ganking for a Renekton lane is quite easy. So there's a lot of ways that you can find advantages, especially because of his gap closers and his targeted stun. His roams are pretty good too. So you can definitely find advantages in other areas other than 1v1 fights if you happen to not really get the best matchup. But I do think his laning is a little bit matchup reliant. If you end up getting counterpicked, it's actually going to be pretty hard, and I would recommend building Tank Renekton in that sort of scenario. Now, Tank Renekton is the pick that's probably a lot more popular than full AD Renekton, but I think full AD Renekton actually does end up having a decent amount of advantages over Tank Renekton when it comes to solo queue only. And full AD Renekton is something that you can actually play in the mid lane as well, especially since he does so well with Ignite and his roams are quite solid, and he's actually amazing versus squishy champions, so you can potentially pick him in the mid lane as a counter pick, and it can surprise a lot of mid lane players because they aren't really used to playing Renekton if they don't play top lane very often, and that's an advantage that can go a long way and can give you some unsuspecting kills too in a lot of games. Now, the downsides of full AD Renekton is that, of course, you're not building tank and you're going to be a lot squishier. Now, I expected full AD Renekton to be pretty terrible in teamfights actually because of that. You would want Renekton to be able to play like a frontline role kind of, but honestly, it turned out to be better than I expected in teamfights, but it does still make your team lack that frontline presence, and the reason why full AD Renekton is better than I personally expected in teamfights is because you can play sort of like an assassin playstyle, but because of his ultimate, he's a lot tankier than your average assassin would be. So if you end up getting a good flank or a good angle, or honestly if you just happen to get in range of the target that you're trying to kill, it's going to be quite easy for you to finish them off because you have a lot of burst, and your escape is pretty good if you use your E to get out of the fight. So it's actually pretty strong, but it does still make your team lack that frontline presence, which can potentially be a problem. So it's very important for you to be able to fit the team comp, and this is why I think full AD Renekton actually works in the mid lane so well, because mid laners don't really have a problem at all if they're building full damage, whereas if you're in the top lane and you're building full damage, it can actually be quite bad in a lot of situations, especially if you don't have a tank jungler or a tank support. But if you're playing with a couple of tanks on your team already, full AD Renekton honestly works really well in solo queue because it's lane dominant, it snowballs like crazy, And it's also going to be good in team fights because you have that frontline presence that can help you make sure that you don't have to be the first one entering the team fight, which is generally what you want to do. You don't want to be the first one entering, you want to be like the second or even third person that enters the team fights, and then you dive in onto the back line either with a flank or just with a good gap closer. Or potentially you could even just do damage to tanks by using the armor shred on the empowered E effect. And overall it's actually quite strong and I had a lot of fun with it. It is a little bit high risk because if you don't really start snowballing you can have a little bit of problems. And definitely if you're falling behind it can be very difficult to play because building damage is never something you really want to do on a champion like Renekton when you're behind. So if you're behind, build tank, but you can go into the game with this playstyle in mind, and honestly I would consider it to be a strong option in solo queue. And if you start snowballing you just carry like crazy hard. It's really powerful, and it's also a very fun option. Like I had a lot of fun with it playing somewhat of a different playstyle to what you would play normally on Renekton, and so it was pretty interesting for me. I played it for about 5 or 6 games. It was pretty cool to see how good or how bad it was and how different it was to the normal tank Renekton playstyle. And so personally I think my verdict is that it's a little bit too high risk for my taste. I don't really like playing these kind of high risk champions that are heavily reliant on snowballing. I'd prefer to play maybe a little bit easier champions, a little bit safer with some nice late game scaling. But if you enjoy champions like Riven or maybe Jax and want an option that's a lot more unpredictable than those champions and a little bit more versatile in terms of build paths, because you can still end up building a lot of tank items by the end of the game anyways, I think that full AD Renekton is actually going to be a really nice option for you, and I definitely recommend that you try it out and see how it goes, because you will at least have a lot of fun for sure.